Good day. Welcome to the opening panel, Promises of the Past. I am Kim Betcher, your moderator, Director of Policy and Program Learning at SIPE, and I've had the privilege of working with the Free Enterprise and Democracy Network with extraordinary people for over a decade now. The flow of today's agenda is going to be from the past to the future, and we're beginning with an examination of how democracy has delivered over the past 35 years or so. Now, as Andrew mentioned in his opening remarks, democracy does demonstrate superior performance compared to other forms of government. Does this through superior governance, through accountability and public goods, as well as through market economies. And democracies actually have 20% higher GDP per capita gains over a period of about 25 years, and also are known for lower economic volatility, to name just a few of the benefits of democracy that delivers. The term democracy delivers is very much alive. Since 2022, USAID has had an initiative, Democracy Delivers. We are, however, in a time of backsliding. There has been declining public trust, the external projection of authoritarian power, and at last year's FEDN conference, I spoke about 3 Ps in play: the performance of democracy, as well as perceptions of democracy, and perils, or the external threats. So it does seem a good moment to reflect on how is democracy holding up? What is our expectation today for democracy that delivers? And has our expectation changed since the early 1990s, a time of great promise and hope? We have, to answer these questions, 3 panelists from FEDN, very distinguished members. And the first is Gala Diaz-Langu from CIPEC, which is the leading Argentine think tank, in fact, a leading Latin American think tank. Gala is executive director, also a professor at Tutela University. She's authored over 50 publications on social policy. She's written, for example, on gender economic equity, and she's done work on cutting-edge issues like corrosive capital, the future of work, and digital economy. Dr. Ali Riaz is a distinguished professor at Illinois State University. He is president of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies. His specialties include democratization and violent extremism, political Islam, South Asian politics, and Bangladeshi politics. And he has a recent book, How Autocrats Rise. And Ruslan Stefanov is program director, chief economist at the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia. He's co-author of The Kremlin Playbook, and has for a long time been knowledge coordinator of the Southeast European Leadership for Development and Integrity, which is a premier civil society anti-corruption network in the Western Balkans, and is an expert on smart specialization for the European Commission. So welcome to our panel. I would like to start the questioning with Professor Riaz. Can you tell us about how you feel that democracy and markets have delivered on expectations over the past 35 years?
Apologies, I was muted. Thank you, Kim, for this opportunity and the question that you've raised with respect to whether democracy has delivered, particularly with respect to market economy as well, is very important to assess the situation. First of all, if we take a broader look at what happened since the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, the 35 years. As a matter of fact, if we look at 1992, 3 years after the fall of Berlin Wall, the autocratization was almost insignificant. 2.87% of the countries were autocratizing, whereas 39% countries were democratizing. Whereas if we look at 2023, more than 10% are only. Now, what we see is this democratization process. So more than 23% is now autocratizing, which means basically the trend, the euphoria, the expectation that we had with respect to the governance, the democratization, didn't actually pan out the way we expected. Then if you look at the countries which have gone through the democratization process, in many instances, we have seen that the economic situation, particularly with respect to delivering the goods, the common goods, in many instances, it has not succeeded in doing so. Not because it is not a uniquely one or two countries, if we take the overall stock. One of the major things that we see with respect to the delivery is that indeed it has made some progress. In that sense, it can be said mixed result. But in large measure, what we have seen in terms of the governance, the common perception has been that the democratization process has led to concentration of power among the elites. That is the perception that has grown. So that's the one side of this governance issue that has precluded the success, so to speak. In terms of the economy, whereas the global economy, one of the major setbacks that we have seen is the COVID, right? And we are still struggling to recoup the situation, and especially newly democratized countries have faced much more other challenges than the larger economies. Even the larger economies have faced this challenge and continue to face this challenge. But with respect to the economy, particularly with respect to delivery, and when we are talking about the delivery of the common goods, such as health issues, such as the basic amenities, despite some cases of the GDP growth that we have seen, one of the major problems has been the increased disparity. If you look at across the board newly democratized countries, you see that it has provided some of the goods, common goods, but it has also contributed to the disparity because of, in large measure, because of the economic structure, particularly, which is very much tied to the system of governance, where elites, or at least a small group of elites, have been able to have, I would say, disproportionate influence. So on the one hand, this democratization process over the last 35 years have opened the opportunity for more participation in the governance in many cases, despite we have seen the democratic backsliding that is taking place and largely in not only new democratic countries, but also in the established democracies such as the United States. We have seen that over the years how one of the major problems has been this notion that the institutions is not exactly functioning to protect those who are in large measure marginalized. So this way, we can say it's a mixed result, but I would say the tilt is largely that our expectations seems to remain unfulfilled. In terms of economy, it is much more evident, especially with respect to disparity. So given the progress we have seen, we have also seen some of the, in terms of governance, the backsliding, autocratization process has increased. Why would go into that hopefully in next round of conversation and the questions. But in terms of economy, the major challenge has been the growing wealth, whether it has been shared, hasn't been in much.
Right. So
most of the
thank you
cases.
so much. Interesting nuance that you have about, some increasing opportunities, I think both politically and economically. But within democracies, or what's under the label of democracy, there are some autocratization challenges happening, and one of the effects we have to look at is inequities, or remaining elites. Gala, can we turn to you? How have things played out?
Well, firstly, thank you, Kim. Thanks, Saip, and thanks also to the Free Enterprise and Democracy Network for the invitation and for making this discussion possible. That seems very relevant. And let me introduce some figures that might contribute to getting an answer. Only in the last 4 years, we have experienced one of the worst global pandemics, reached the highest temperature on the record of the world, faced extreme weather events, bred two massive international wars, seen authoritarianism spread, democracy backsliding everywhere, and inequalities widen. And as a result, we have shocking socio-economic indicators. Around 700 million people in the world are facing hunger, and about 650 million people live under poverty. This is a situation which was obviously exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and has caused the largest increase in extreme global in extreme poverty globally in the past decades. There's a very shocking indicator, which is that 4 years ago, it was more likely for us to attain SDG 2, which is to eradicate hunger, than what it is today. Global inequalities are also reaching striking levels. According to Oxfam, the global South countries own just 31% of the global worth, despite concentrating 79% of the world's population. These global phenomena are not indifferent to gender, to race, to ethnicities, and other variables. For instance, between 2020 and 2024, the 5 richest men in the world have doubled their fortune, whereas almost 5 billion people have become poorer. These wicked problems, which are dynamic, which are interdependent in its components, have also an intersecting nature. When they interact between each other and with others, their effects are reinforced. For example, climate change affects disproportionately the already underprivileged or marginalized groups, such as women and countries in the global South. As such, these phenomena constitute very crucial elements of the economic, the political, the environmental, religious, and also the social crisis that we are facing globally, which are now commonly known as the polycrisis. Therefore, this raises also the bar of what the solution needs to be for these problems, because we have complex problems, we need complex solutions, and solutions, in order to be efficient, need to have a holistic and an intersecting approach, which I am sure we can discuss further later on.
Thank you, Gala. All right, wicked problems, raising the bar, putting a lot of stress on populations and institutions. And Ruslan, from your corner of the world, how do you see it? I mean, you're pretty close to where the Berlin Wall once was.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for the invite. Thanks to Saip. I think, first of all, congratulations for focusing on democracy that delivers. As you might have seen in the new book of Tony Blair on leadership, he has chosen exactly that focus, which means people would expect governance systems to deliver, and that is what I think is the key criticism to our liberal democracy developments in the past 30 years in Central and Eastern Europe. And yes, this is both where the fault line was, where the Berlin Wall was, and as we say, where we saw actually the energy Berlin Wall still existing, with the recent invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and where we're also facing this fault line that was seen as existed for so many years and is still there in the Middle East. So I think we need to probably look at it from a little bit from a different perspective to change our understanding. Because I remember SIPE was our SIPE was CSD's first partner back in the 90s, help us out develop different market economy instruments and democratization instruments. And these were rosy times. These were the times of the end of history. These were times where we thought this will never happen again. And I think we've been both kind of overjoyful that this division ended, but also we've been quite naive to think that this might not repeat. And rather, I would say that in a way now, looking at it from the current standpoint, you see that it's a journey, and it will essentially never end. We will have to reinvent both democracy and how we manage, our market economies. How do we ensure that it delivers for everyone? Clearly, a growing population in the world. Clearly, people getting out of poverty, on a massive scale. Although a big part of that is in China, but also in Europe. I mean, if you look at Europe, Central and Eastern Europe was the most dynamically developing region. Yes, there are a lot of inequalities, but if I can very oversimplify, of course, or oversimplify, clearly what we've seen is that the market economy has delivered. What we've created has lifted up a lot in what has happened in Central and Eastern Europe. And at the same time, people have expected that democracy would deliver on many different issues. One of them is clearly rising inequality. We need to figure out how our governance systems, how we govern our financial system, how do we allow others to make use of that financial system? I mean, after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, we're seeing very much that we've allowed actually Russia and to benefit from a system that they actively want to destroy now, which is something that we need to learn to manage. We need to learn to see how we could continue doing business with somebody that actually very actively wants to destroy the very foundations of the system that we built. And the same goes for China as we speak. One of the things that I found astounding is we see a lot of talk about alternative models of democracy, alternative models of market economy, but we don't see those models. When both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, we see China simply waiting out for others to undermine what the West, so-called, has built. But China is part of that system. China is part of the governing bodies at the UN. And actually, if anybody saw the gridlock at the UN, at the General Assembly, that is something that people also don't like, that it didn't deliver on a massive, both on this global scale, but also people want a faster delivery in Europe on different, migration issues, on the economy, competitiveness, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a very timely discussion, and we haven't figured this out. And I think both ourselves, we need to revisit some of the clear successes, which is mostly in terms of market economy, in terms of rekindling people's entrepreneurship, but also in the way we think about our democracy nationally and also in our collective international system. Clearly, we are in the same boat with partners, if you want, that claim that they want the same actual end results, but not contributing to that. Thank you.
I appreciate, Ruslan, that you've brought out this idea of a journey, which fits nicely with the conference theme of a crossroads. And you've mentioned how it's necessary to manage and reinvent political and economic systems, and at the same time, perhaps to manage expectations in the sense that we cannot be naive. We have to be vigilant on the journey. So I'm really feeling how interconnected the problems are. And so for the next question, I'd really like to sort of separate out some of the international dimensions of democracy challenges or threats to democracy, and some of the domestic challenges you may be observing. Quick note to the audience, our participants, guests. So we love that people are using the chat, encourage that. And when you do get a break, you'll notice there are a couple of exhibitor booths that are actually on this sort of transnational challenges, how you respond, or how you empower people locally. And we have colleagues there for an informal chat on that. So let's go in the same order now. Ali, are you more concerned about domestic weaknesses that are drivers, or even things that are limiting democracy's ability to adapt and respond to today's challenges? Or are you more concerned about some of the international environment?
These are largely linked to my understanding, because making that separation between the domestic and international at one level is fine, because what we see in the domestic level is, to me, a major problem that I see is the polarization, the pernicious polarization that we have witnessed, especially in the democratization process, meaning the emerging democracies. Again, it is not exclusive to emerging democracies, but also very much present in the consolidated democracies, which is in some ways contributing to the deconsolidation of democracy. The United States is a case in point. But there are the inequality issue, the rising disparity that I mentioned, is not a contribution of the domestic elements only. It has an international dimension too. How the states are connected to the global economy, who are benefiting out of it, how the structure is made. That's why when we say that whether the threat is coming from the within or without, meaning outside, it is somewhat challenging to make that separation. So for me, the challenges that comes from within, especially again, driving the same point that inequality is one issue. The second thing is the marginalization, at least perceived marginalization of a larger population. Because when we talk about democracy, there are many indices to measure. But one thing that I consider is very important in understanding democracy, whether it's working or not, is whether it is successfully or in some ways accommodating and protecting the minority, not only in terms of religious minority, in terms of political minority, in terms of the ethnic minority. Protection of minority, incorporating them, their voices, if the system doesn't allow to do so, that remains very much a challenge to democracy. So these are the issues that has not been dealt adequately in the emerging democracy. Then, as Ruslan has mentioned, with respect to the rise of these two forces, Russia and China, especially given the deep pocket of China and its assertive policy, it has contributed, because they not only offer an ideology, but it offers a sort of an economic system or support that apparently is very alluring, very much tempting to adopt. And many of these authoritarian rulers around the world, and particularly where we have seen post 1989, first the democratization process goes up, then we saw the rise of the hybrid regime, and then many of them has become autocratic regimes, electoral autocracy. They are adopting this. So, and this is a kind of argument that democracy can be pushed on the back burner when we are involved in development or in some kinds of GDP growth. So there is a convergence of these two. The autocratization process doesn't come from outside only. It is supported by, but not necessarily exclusively an external element. It is from within. And within that, many of these issues that we have seen, including the pernicious polarization, weakness of institutions, because the institutions do get up, but at one level it becomes stunted and it fails to accommodate the aspiration and expectation So democratic institutions, governance particularly, and then the economic institution which fails to, or at least is not successful in terms of delivering equal opportunities. So opportunities are created, but these are limited. It remains elusive to some of the people within the country. That is the domestic one, but that's not exclusively domestic, because it is connected to the global economy and how the states are, how these countries are engaged in. So to me, the threats are both. But if you have to, if you're asking me to put a rate on it or somewhat put it in a spectrum, I would say the threat mostly starts from within, and then it gets supported by the external one who have their own agenda. That creates this problem going forward. So the challenges are both, but it starts from the domestic elements.
Okay. So we have to look at the convergence, and the external can exacerbate the internal. So Gala, where do you look?
I'm pretty much on the same page. I mean, these are two clear problems that are interconnected, and they can exacerbate one another. And let me explain how I see it. Authoritarian encroachment is an immediate threat. Whether foreign or domestically, it can directly undermine the core principles of democracy. And when authoritarian leaders gain power, they often suppress political opposition, curtail civil liberties, and manipulate institutions. We have seen it time and time again. And in an international context, this can mean to interfere also in political process of democracies with disinformation campaigns, with economic coercion, with destabilizing democratic governance globally. But in this context, weaknesses in democratic market systems can be seen also as a root cause. At the same time, this can create a fertile ground for authoritarianism to thrive. And there's much of a transversal, cross-cutting problem that we are seeing globally, which is a huge crisis on trust, on interpersonal trust, but also in trust in our institutions. There's a growing sense of disbelief and disenchantment in traditional political parties around the globe, for instance, which leads to less participation, to higher voter apathy, and also it is widening the gap between citizens and political representatives. This crisis of representation is also another aspect of the polycrisis that I was mentioning before. And simultaneously, there is a decrease in mutual tolerance and a polarization that goes hand in hand with a proliferation of disrespect for opposing stances. This is an extremely fertile ground and it is also exacerbated by poor economic outcomes, as we are seeing in some parts of the world. And there's a huge focus that we must put in this context in what our social fabric is made out of, and how can we fight this decay in interpersonal trust and in institutional trust. Latin America might be a paradigmatic case in this context. There's particularly in Argentina, we have not seen job creation, we have not seen growth for over 13 years, and over half of our population are currently living under poverty. And this is very clearly reflected in how the people see the government and see democratic institutions. Only 17% of people who live in Argentina trust the government. This figure globally is 47%, it's much higher. The only solution in this case, and I'm sure we can talk about this a bit later on, but it is to strengthen democracy. There's no way out of rebuilding this trust, of fighting the crisis of representation without democracy. And we have seen time and time again, and there are many studies that show that there is growth, but there is no sustained development possible without democracy. So I think we should ask ourselves the question, how can we reverse these trends that we're seeing?
Thank you, Gala, and for focusing us in on this particular gap between citizens and their representatives. Ruslan, I'm going to guess here, I'm going to bet that you're going to talk about transnational threats because you've written about the Kremlin playbook, but maybe I'm not right.
You have a crystal ball, Kim. Well, clearly, what Russia is doing is an assault on the democratic system that, at least here in the EU, we're trying to build, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. And like I mentioned in my previous intervention, China has supported that, and that is scary. Because in a way, what we see there is two of the members of the Security Council essentially launching an assault on a we could disagree on many issues, but again, this is a system imbalance that has been kind of developing throughout the years, and they're saying we disagree with that balance. At the same time, as I mentioned, they don't offer any alternative. I got the feeling that, for example, clearly, I mean, if you look at the communiques of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee, and if you look at the at Russia's and the Kremlin's statements, this is the revisionist. I mean, both a revisionist, but also kind of deeply unhappy power that says, look, we don't think there is a balance. We disagree with that. And somehow we want to roll back everything that happened after 1996. And by the way, we don't want an EU. We want to deal with countries separately, one by one. At the same time, they do not offer any tangible alternative. The same goes with China. China says we have our own democracy that's different from yours. We're kind of we want to have more social democracy. At the same time, we base more technology and so on and so forth. We disagree on that, of course. And also, we have a market economy that we think we might have gotten right following the 2008 crisis. I think this is what happens. Somehow, people started to think, and this has been happening in the past. Remember the 60s or the 70s, there was an enchantment with what the Soviet system could deliver fast, quickly, assertively, fast rising in income levels, but it was not sustainable. So right now, I feel clearly there's been an assault from these two very powerful members of the Security Council of the UN. At the same time, we've kind of not built, or we've allowed our institutions to, as we said in the Kremlin playbook, it's always been about us, our own internal, weaknesses or gaps, in terms of governance. And this you could very clearly see. I mean, if you look at the academic work on Central and Eastern Europe, you will see that the only country that actually made a statistically significant break with corruption in the past after becoming a member of the EU from Central and Eastern Europe was actually Estonia. So all of the other countries, to one or another extent, academically, did not deliver that, which means this feeling of, so we have to look at two things. One is what the market economy, what the markets and democratic systems we were building and we're still building. And as I mentioned, I think this is an ongoing process and will always be delivered. And I think this is something that we could very clearly see as a success. And then the second thing is, what do people see and understand from this success? How do they perceive that delivery system? And this is when they look also into politics. And then if we see kind of falling participation rates, if we see votes for parties that want to actually actively engage in reducing the democratic institutions, to mere shows, or going back to a more authoritarian system, like we see voices, in Eastern Germany most recently, saying that China and Russia are doing better, faster. Then you see same thing in Austria, same thing in the Netherlands, same thing in Slovakia, also in Hungary, in Bulgaria, Western Balkans. So it's we've been wondering, has the transformative effect of democracy waned? And I would say we've been asking this in the past 2 or 3 years, and the right thing to ask. But I don't see that. I don't see the alternative. I don't see a viable option that we could say yes. And that's why I think people have this cognitive dissonance. People don't, they don't like what they've seen recently, in particular in the political realm. And remember, technological changes, the social media, this has changed tremendously the way we exercise our basic democratic rights. And at the same time, we need time to take that on board. And how do we perceive that? And at the same time, we look at as somebody put here in our internal chat, the how many people went out of poverty, how many, how on a global scale, if you look at the global level, actually inequality declined. But then if you look at local pockets, in certain areas, like actually across Central and Eastern Europe, this increased. So these are very complex social, political, religious issues. And that's why I firmly believe that we still haven't found a better system to deal with that than democratic representation of different voices and looking for solutions. Thank you.
All right. So much like Gala was saying, we have no alternative. We have no better alternative. Now, I would like to actually bring a few questions from the audience for your consideration. Now, I'll just take a round of questions, and then each panelist, you choose which ones that you want to respond to. So let me just bring out a round of questions here. One about main reasons for deteriorating democracy. Is it lack of knowledge, or is it greed and ego? Another question about what variables do we look at when measuring democracy? I know there are a variety of indicators, but maybe if there's an indicator that you look at closely, what might that be? And a question about tension between free markets and inequality. To what extent are constraints on market freedom necessary to reduce inequality or help those left behind? And what can we do to counter the domination of Russia and China? So I think that's about 4 questions. I don't expect to get to all of them. It's the panelist discretion. Who would like to start? Gala, please.
Thanks, Kim. So I would like to start with the second one and what to look at in order to strengthen and how to measure a possible strengthening in democracy. And there I would like to differentiate 2 levels. One, it is the formal procedures of democracy. So elections, exchanges of power between different political parties, how long the mandates are, if there is re-election indefinitely or not, how are the exchanges between the different powers, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, etc. But there's for me, a deeper, a more profound dimension of democracy, which are the democratic principles and the democratic values that we need in order to have a very strong, a very virile democracy everywhere, which is how we interact with each other. What degrees of violence are there in our public speech? How do we deal with disinformation? How do we use evidence in our political processes? And that dimension, I believe, is being a bit overlooked. And I think that it is crucial. It is the backbone of democracy. And it's the reason we need to have a stronger approach to the principles, to the values of democracy, in order to have the procedures of democracy fulfill its their goal, no, to have a stronger democratic fabric overall. So there are very different things that we might look at, because seeing the frequency and the freedom and the efficiency of elections is different than looking at the violence that we have on social networks and in public debates on social networks, for instance. So I think we should start mixing up a bit these two different spectrums of what we understand by democracy, the procedures, but also the values and the principles.
I really appreciate that. That's really key context and nuance here. Ali, any responses?
Could you please repeat the fourth question that you mentioned a little bit?
Was it a particular one, or do you want me to summarize?
The fourth one that you mentioned.
Fourth one. The last one I had was around countering domination by Russia and China, and the one before that was about tension between free markets and inequality.
Right. The countering the Russian and Chinese influence, that's one thing. I think, I mean, the growing influence in the assertive policies China is going to, in some measures, continue to be a threat. But it needs to be confronted, or in some ways addressed at two levels. One of them is, of course, the domestic one. What actually gives the opportunity within a particular country of this influence of China or Russia, for that matter? In case of China, in case of, if we look at Africa and partly maybe in Latin America, but in large measure Africa and some of the Asian countries, the Chinese influence has opened up because of the lack of economic growth or economic development as it is packaged by the governments in the respective country. And in many instances, that creates the opportunity for a small group of people to engage in corruption and in kleptocracy. So the Chinese influence outside the country is fine in the sense that they would keep on doing that one, the challenges they pose largely at the global level. But its influence becomes more effective when there is opening within the domestic politics. Economy is one. So long there is lack of accountability mechanism, the proliferation of corruption, in some extent kleptocracy in some measure. These are the domestic elements which create this opportunity for China. If not Russia, definitely for China, those opportunities are created. So at the global level, when we are talking about those who actually support the democracy, those who would like to see that democracy and free market operates and works and delivers, their battle is at one level. That is the global level. But until and unless we see that within the domestic political situation and the economic situation, there are enough preventive measures to stop the pathway, stop the possible intrusion, possible influence of China, it would continue to be a threat, to see my point. So what I see is that that's why I said previously that on the one hand, we understand the difference between domestic elements and the international one, but it converges in such a manner nowadays that simply thinking that, okay, some people are going to fight at the international level. I have nothing to do with China. It's me in, say, in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or say, in Pakistan, in the South Asian context. That separation is not sufficient enough. We need to understand that domestic political dynamics and opportunities create the open the door for Chinese influence, and in some ways strengthen the Chinese argument that even without the democracy, they can deliver. The long term, they don't. That creates more problem, but that's the long term issue. One of the critical elements is that it is short-termism. Most of these, in emerging democracies or those which are on the pathway to a sort of autocratization or autocratic regime, they want to deliver, at least apparently they want to deliver something that looks good. So that they can provide, that understanding, if that can be stopped within the country through the democratic accountable mechanism, only then would see that Chinese influence might not be as profound, as important, as influential in that respect. Thanks.
Great. I see we have more questions coming in. I'm hoping that we can continue the dialogue in the chat, and the Secretariat's definitely taking note. So one more reply from Ruslan, and then I want to get a final comment from each of our speakers on where to go from here. Ruslan?
I also go to one of the questions also on the concerns the EU and democratic backsliding in countries like Hungary, and how does that work? I think we've been blessed of having lived in a period past the Berlin Wall when we actually had partners that cared, and actually we managed to build institutions within the EU and those countries that managed to get into the EU that actually make it part of the process of joint development, that partners are interested in our common good. And I think this is the biggest kind of transformative power of the EU. And even as you have internal, and you could see this very clearly between countries that are not within the EU, like if you wish, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, or Armenia. Georgia and Armenia probably the most clear example, but also Central Asian former Soviet republics, and the ones that were part of the EU. You see those thousands of not very visible, but still very clear and links. I mean, you have them on institutional level, where the EU goes after Viktor Orban. He's now the president of the European Council, rotating presidency, and he goes into the European Parliament, and they discuss there. So he faces accountability. So he faces the EU kind of works on those transformative funds on politically and so on and so forth. And we can debate how effective that is or not. But the fact of life is that there are a lot of choices that countries that are within this club have, and that help develop both democratically and economically, including on a personal level. You could, because you have a free movement of people, because you have a free enterprise and capital, you could actually move to another country and still be impactful back in Hungary or in Bulgaria or any place else. So that's extremely important. And I think it's also the importance. There was a question about the importance of institutions, but again, all these institutions, they're as important as we make them work. And I think one of the critical elements here is to pay attention that this is precisely why Russia wants to attack these institutions like the EU. They say we want to. If you remember Lavrov's words right before the invasion in Ukraine, they were like, we completely disregard the EU. We want to work country to country, because this is what we got in the late 19th, beginning of 20th century. But secondly, it's also important to reinforce each other and to respect these laws, because Hungary, for example, they get voted certain laws, and then when the European court struck them down, they changed them. So you have all these different aspects, on many different levels that do impact development. And one of the discontents has been, and actually, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing today, this uncertainty and kind of backsliding across the world, is that the US and the EU have kind of grown much more introvert. I mean, there is, again, repeating this discussion of, okay, do we need that? Do we need to engage with the world? Which is exactly what China is doing. They say, okay, we're fine because they're undermining the US and the EU standing, so we'll let them undermine it, not caring that it's actually the same world we're living in. So if you do that, then you're actually inheriting a broken world. The next population is going to inherit a broken world. So these are the important discussions that we need to continue leading, and that's why I think SIPES is an important player in that. Thank you.
Wow, I'm not feeling naive anymore after listening to you. Okay, final words of wisdom from each of our panelists. So given that we here, I imagine everybody on the call believes in democracy, and given that we're not seeing a better alternative to democracy, where do you see an opportunity for leadership today to help make democracy deliver, to help strengthen it? Gala, do you have a view on that?
Yes, we're clearly at a crossroads. There's an inflection point that's going on, and what we have in the future is uncertain. The role that leadership has in this context is crucial. And I would highlight three concrete aspects that need to be worked on. We have seen, and we have been discussing throughout the webinar, a distance in results versus expectations. And the way to close that is to work on state capabilities, on how to deliver concretely and how to build a more effective state to deliver better public goods and concretely services. This is a very great challenge, a huge challenge for many southern countries, and there's a focus to be put there on how can we be more effective in order to achieve a higher GDP per capita. And this also has a concrete correlation between good governance indicators and greater delivery overall in terms of growth, but also in the quality of life that people can agree. We can, in this context particularly, use a lot of the digital innovations that are around, for instance, how to use artificial intelligence in order to have more of a predictive view of the future. In many southern countries, the best scenario we have is that we are driving, seeing the mirror that looks backwards, not looking forward. And in many cases, we're completely blind. We don't even have old information. So we need to have good information in order to be able to prosper. The second thing, there's a huge role for citizen engagement. There has been a question in the chat regarding grassroots mobilizations, and I would widen it because beyond leadership, there is citizen engagement is perhaps the most critical factor for revitalizing democracy. And around the world, we are seeing how there are several movements led by citizens that are demanding greater accountability, participation, and also equity, from anti-corruption protests to climate activism. And this resurgence that we are witnessing in democratic engagement is revitalizing and very hopeful for me. And the third one, and I always like to pitch in what we can do and what can organizations like ours do in this type of context. And I would like that there are three concrete actions that think tanks, international organizations, universities can contribute to navigate in this particular scenario that we have. The first one is forward thinking. We have a very uncertain scenario currently globally, but there are things we know. And we can base ourselves on those things we do know in order to assess different possible scenarios for what we don't know, and focusing on the long term and what are the dilemmas that we can anticipate, and what can we do in order to reduce political instability or the implications of the climate crisis, etc. In order to do that, and this is the second issue, is to use evidence. We know that research can be pragmatic, can be usable for decision making, and that we can have better decisions if we use evidence. And in order in order for the research to be impactful, it needs to be feasible in terms of its implications, not only in terms of the financially, but also technically and mostly politically in this type of scenario. And the third one is to be a space where we can enable dialogue. I am not even saying enabling consensus. In many cases, I don't think that consensus is possible, but at least it is useful to have dialogue spaces and to understand where we do have consensus and where we don't have consensus. Because sometimes we are agreeing on 80% of an issue, but we're focusing on the 20% that we are not agreeing on. And instead of discussing that 20%, we could be working on actions concretely based on the 80% that we do agree on. So I think there's a huge role for us in that sense. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So, delivery, engagement, and dialogue to move forward. Really about a minute for you, Professor Ali.
Let me reiterate. I see it two ways. The first thing, which seems that we all agree on, delivering the public goods, making the mechanism of the state an effective state which actually delivers the public good, not only in terms of the regular thing. I think health, education, and other public services that needs to be delivered until and unless we actually engage the states in that kind of thing in a visible manner, so that there are people who feel that they are being accounted for, they know they have been taken into account and they're delivered. So that's the effectiveness of states needs to increase, and which requires perhaps more decentralization, reaching to the lower, as close to the home possible in the countries. That I see as the changes that needs in the state effectiveness. The second thing is taming down the rhetorical divisiveness. That has become, as I mentioned about the pernicious polarization. Within the United States, outside the United States, everywhere, what we see is that divisiveness has become the goal, the objective of the politician, in some cases states as well. Until and unless the rhetoric of divisiveness is tamed down, and engagement of people needs to be increased, but the divisiveness would not help. So these are the two areas I see that if it is to be delivered, the one hand on the market, on the state's effectiveness, the other thing is the politicians, where when we're talking about we or the civil society can actually contribute taming down. Kim, you are muted.
Thank you for the focus, Professor Ali. Ruslan, a quick word, final comment.
I'd say we need to continue doing what we're focusing also with SITE more recently on tackling state capture in all of its forms. And actually, this is what democracy and market economy are meant to deliver: deconcentrating power and making sure that more stakeholders have access to that power and to checks and accountability of that power. And for that, critically important, we need to call upon responsible leaders globally, including reaching out to China, but also more importantly, making sure that in each and all of our countries, as civil society, we promote that debate and we ask from our leaders responsible leadership and taking care that what we've built actually stays longer. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. In this session, I've I've heard a lot of nuance, which I expected from the FEDN members, that there has been progress, there have been openings and progress, but also tremendous demands on the systems. And while I expected the session to be sobering, I'm also pleased that it appears that we are, in the view of our experts, at a crossroads. And in a time of backsliding, a crossroads is a good thing. That we're looking forward at how to strengthen democracy, how to make democracy deliver. And throughout the day, the next portion of the day will be about some impactful and innovative actions, initiatives that people are taking on some of these challenges. Please check them out, and then a session looking forward on who's going to get the job done. So thank you, please, everybody. I know we're virtual, but a big round of applause for our FEDN members. You're the people who make my job worthwhile. So thank you so much.